Which channel do the games work on? Can't actually believe how good this looks.
Will you turn that off, please? I need to use the phone.
Now this is almost lifelike. Care package.
Can you come and load the dishwasher?
I can't mini game.
Well, pause it then.
It's not 1997. What it is. Welcome back to another episode of VGT. I am VGT Yor, and today we're going to be talking about procedural generation and the future of gaming in general. It's a big topic, but I have some thoughts on it, and you know that I like to get in front of the mic and just babble shit. So that's what we're here for today. So we are fairly deep into the 21st century now, and computational power continues to grow exponentially, and that means that every few years or so we experience substantial leaps in our home entertainment setups. And also, because video game graphics and video game immersion continuously grow, so too do the player's expectations. Mate, these graphics are dog shit. And therefore developers are constantly trying to develop bigger and better games to adhere to those expectations. When I say bigger, I don't mean the length of time that you play the game for. I'm talking about the file size of the game. So making a game is a very complex art with a lot of different parts that the game creators have to juggle in order to give the gamer a satisfying experience. Let's use GTA 6 as an example. So what do us as gamers expect from Rockstar from the next Grand Theft Auto? Firstly, we will be expecting a large open world. Now, considering that Grand Theft Auto 5 came out in 2013, 7 years ago now, and we probably won't get GTA 6 for another 3, maybe 4 years, we will be certainly expecting a considerably larger open world than Los Santos from GTA 5. We'll expect to see better graphics. Again, if GTA 5 is 10 years old by the time that GTA 6 comes out, I think that is a pretty reasonable request from the gamer, that we have some graphical improvements and upgrades. We'll be expecting a complete and fully playable single player campaign mode, as well as an online mode after the success of GTA 5 Online. There'll be an expectation that load times for the game are reduced, and also that the game should run well at hopefully 60 frames per second, on the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X. And finally, we need the game to not take up too much of our internal memory on the consoles. So those are all base level assumptions we can make about what to expect from the next Grand Theft Auto game. But the problem that the developers will have is meeting those expectations, as trying to adhere to one of those expectations directly impacts the ability of being able to meet another. For example, a bigger world with better graphics means that there'll be more in-game assets, and each of those assets will contain a higher polygon count per asset. And what do you think that means for the file size of the game? Likewise, what do you think it means for the load times? More assets, higher polygon counts means more to load into the video game world. Now, advancements in hardware for the next generation of consoles should battle some of these issues, but you understand what I mean about it being very much a balancing act.
Ah, yes, not to worry, there is a simple solution.
All of these problems go away if we just whack a massive SSD in the new consoles. Well, kind of, but this is where we run into our next variable, and that is cost. You see, the exponential growth of video game potential essentially outruns the speed at which cost-effective, publicly available hardware grows. And this is because hardware has to actually be produced out of real raw materials that cost money. The more complex the hardware, the harder they are to manufacture, the higher the cost of the components. This is why we end up seeing graphical demos that look like this. But then we see games that look like this. Now, I'm not trying to downplay what the next generation hardware can do, but it looks some way off this. This level of graphical fidelity is achievable because all of the other variables that we discussed were not at play when creating this graphical demo. So it essentially doesn't matter how much space it takes up on the hard drive. Yet, if you were to make a GTA 6 sized world, bustling with life, teeming with cars, light bouncing off every puddle, technically speaking, yes, our next generation home consoles could run that game, but you'd probably have to fucking remortgage your house in order to afford a suitably sized SSD to hold that game and whatever other games you own. The final variable in this cocktail of considerations for video game creators is time. Bigger game, better graphics, advanced gameplay techniques, more immersion, bigger worlds. What does all this mean for the developers? It means it's going to take a lot more time to create.
Well, they just need more staff, don't they?
Well, yeah, they do. But then that affects the cost, doesn't it? Because, think about it. Games, AAA games at least, release at sort of a base level price. At the moment, it's like 50 quid in the UK. So that means that this game, which is considered a AAA title, but made by a handful of developers, will shelf at the same price as this game, which took many more years and thousands more people who all needed paying wages, but they cost the same. Okay, so what's all this about? What am I getting to? Well, there are many techniques that developers use in order to get the best out of their games whilst adhering as best they can to the expectation of the gamers. In my opinion, none will become more important, more useful, or more implemented in the coming decade and beyond than procedural generation. So what is procedural generation? It's the idea that content within the video game will be created quasi-randomly by a computer rather than a human developer. You've lost me, mate. What the fuck is quasi-randomly? It means that the human inputs certain values or rules into a computer algorithm, and then the computer uses that algorithm to randomly generate video game content within the boundaries of the rules that the human set.
Are you still with me?
Procedural generation is nothing new. It's been in video games for many years. Civilization uses procedural generation to map out the terrain of its maps. Many dungeon crawlers use procedural generation, like Diablo or Binding of Isaac. Minecraft and No Man's Sky use procedural generation to create whole worlds or whole universes of endless, boring nothing. Other games use procedural generation less for world building and more about things like loot drops, enemy spawns, or sort of environmental assets that you can interact with. Now, there are pros and there are cons currently to using procedural generation. For example, the more that your game is procedurally generated, the less control you have over narrative features such as storytelling. That's why 20 or 30 hour campaign games like The Last of Us 2 don't have any procedural generation in them, because the story and the way it's played is all handcrafted from start to finish. You will follow that certain singular path. Another problem with procedural generation is that it can be very hard to get it to work in the way you want it to. This is because programmers working on the game need to come up with a sound solution for the game to essentially be able to test and fix its own bugs. What happens if a character spawns in a room with no doors and no way out? Or what happens if the objective lies in an unreachable area that the player can never get to? The algorithm needs to be able to recognize these problems and correct them before the game world is loaded in. So what are some of the pros of procedural generation? Well, the big one is that procedural generation can massively reduce the file size of a game. This is because a procedurally generated world has a catalogue of assets that it can draw from, and it has an algorithm which is essentially a set of rules, and those are the only things that need to be stored in the game's file size. Everything else is built on the fly within the game when it's turned on. You can also have procedurally generated loot and procedurally generated difficulty in a game, like I touched on earlier, which essentially can infinitely test the player. So the better the player plays, the harder the game is for them. The harder the game is, the better the rewards. So how does this all link into the future of game development? It's important to understand that players still want bespoke, narrative-driven experiences, and it's for that reason that we're unlikely to see a massive shift towards completely procedurally generated games anytime in the future, especially not for big video game companies making AAA titles. But what I do expect to see is integration of the two together on much bigger scales than what we see at the moment. Let's go back to GTA 6 as our example, and for argument's sake, let's call the world Los Santos 2.0. Now, in GTA 5, I could play that game forever. It will look really nice. It's a great game to play. But the world itself, from the moment I turn the game on in 2013 to the moment I turn it off for the last time in 2023, the buildings are all exactly the same and in exactly the same places. Construction sites are still under construction. All the businesses on the streets are the exact same businesses that were there at the start. Everything essentially stays the same. Now, imagine Los Santos 2.0. The world itself, for the most part, is created and crafted by human developers. However, once you turn that game on and you enter Los Santos 2.0 for the first time, the world becomes alive to procedural generation. An algorithm is set that prevents the world from changing in any way that would impact on the story that is being told or the way the game carries out the narrative. However, buildings can burn down and new ones be built in their places. Randomized areas can be unlocked and added to the game on the fly. Procedurally generated weather can have direct impact on the environment, such as rain causing floods, thunder causing blackouts, or tornadoes tearing down buildings. Again, I'm just using GTA 6 as an example here. These kind of things might be way more suited for different worlds, like potentially Elder Scrolls 6 or something like that. To me, this procedurally generated, handcrafted combination game could be a really exciting way to take games forward on the next generation, whilst providing massive game experiences that don't need to be completely handcrafted. Now, if you've got this far and you're still thinking, that doesn't seem likely to me, it seems like a pipe dream. Like, can procedural generation even work that well? Are we there yet? But before we go, I just want to do a quick crossover with one of my other big hobbies aside from video games, and that is being a complete science nerd. And when I came across this thing that I'm going to show you now, it absolutely blew my mind to smithereens, right? And I thought it tied really well in with this concept of procedural generation in video games. It's called Conway's Game of Life. John Conway was a British mathematician who developed a really simple 2D game that demonstrated one of the most mind-bendingly awesome discoveries of the technological era. So in this game, you have a grid of squares like this. Each square has two states, populated or unpopulated. Along with this, there are 4 simple rules. Rule number 1, any populated cell with fewer than 2 populated neighbours dies or becomes unpopulated. Rule number 2, any populated cell with 2 or 3 populated neighbours lives. Rule number 3, any populated cell with more than 3 populated neighbours dies, as if from overcrowding. Rule number 4, any unpopulated cell with exactly 3 populated neighbours becomes a populated cell, as if by birth. So now if you take this grid and you populate some squares and you leave others unpopulated, and then you hit the play button, the game follows these simple rules and this sort of thing begins to happen. Leave the game running long enough and you can clearly see that out of 4 very basic rules, immense complexity can be created arbitrarily. And this is the absolute untapped potential of procedural generation in video games. We are just now scratching the surface of what procedural generation can do and how it can be implemented into our game worlds to improve player experience and increase player immersion. In the next 10 years, we may be talking about video game worlds that are truly alive to dynamic change through randomization. We may be having conversations that are like, what does your Los Santos look like? Mine looks like this. Oh shit, that building burned down on yours. Well, this dickhead next door has built an extension round his house and now it's fucking ruined my views. And suddenly this doesn't seem so impossible. The future of gaming is alive. If you made it to the end, thank you so much for sticking around and watching this video. I know it's been a rambly one. I know it was quite tech heavy as well, but it's just something that I really wanted to talk about. So if you like the video, please like, subscribe if you're new here. It's a massive help. Tell me what you think about the things that we've talked about in this video. If you agree, if you disagree, what are your thoughts on it? And that's it. I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.